So, hi, Andy.
Hi, Lisa.
Hi. Thanks for joining me this afternoon. Can you tell us a bit about your amazing positive projects that you have in Teesside and the ways that you use the creative arts?
Thanks for asking. It's lovely to be able to speak about it. Because we've chatted a little bit about this. It's good to sort of reframe it. So, like I consider like everything that we do is like an intersection of lots of different things. So it's community development, but at the intersection of creativity, spirituality, understanding the self, understanding other, and it's and about communities being able to lead their own change. So a lot of the work that we do is sort of community led, community organizing based, where we quite often are like an initiator to something, but where we hope that the community and individuals then pick up the opportunity to change things and to see their town differently and to see their neighborhood differently. And what we do sort of splits between multiple levels. It's the what can we do? So our work for FreeStyle is the sort of broad umbrella that we lump it all under. That's the hyper local stuff where we'll be an initiator in a neighborhood. Like I live in a neighborhood really close to town that's got like a fairly unique identity, and it's trapped between the thingness of Gresham and the thingness of Linthorpe, and it's kind of like a something in between. And each of these different areas have got their own little unique identity because it was once part of Ayrsham, but Ayrsham's been dissolved as a concept. And so we like Holgate is the sort of rough identity that we're working with this. So we've got the hyper local stuff. Then there's the town-wide that we do where FreeStyle gets engaged in like big conversations and often drags in like out of its heartbeat creativity as a way of organizing ways of seeing collective wisdom, like trying to capture the complex nuanced way that people think in interesting ways that sort of changes the way that we look at that information and tries to de-other like the differences in our community. And then so that's two levels. There's the hyper local, there's the wider Middlesbrough stuff, and then there's something where we work really closely with this big broad network of others, and that's Community Connectors. And so it kind of falls into these three: hyper local as FreeStyle, Middlesbrough as FreeStyle, and then what we do to be goodness in a much wider network of people. So with the hyper local, we do loads of like creativity really deeply informs a lot of what we do. So Urban Rebirth is our alley network where us and lots of people from other alleys, like who live in the streets in the town centre, do work on alleys to sort of regenerate them and to bring them to life and to recast them as like third places where you can host interesting, like we've done galleries in our alley before, and that was really cool. Like before the pandemic, we had like twice a year we do a thing called Blueprint where we work to, this is Community Connectors, but FreeStyle taps into that. We'll host like alley makeovers where a load of us will get together, we'll completely transform an alley in the course of 60 minutes and then lend help to the next alley down the road, so that over a weekend we could do like 4 alleys. And then it's brilliant because then we get to host these amazing conversations with like the people who live in the neighborhood, and it starts with relationship, and then it quite often unearths all of this stuff about the human experience of living in that place. And maybe what they needed wasn't an alley transformation, but that could be like a way of tapping into some bigger questions about what makes them tick and what like quite often makes them sad about the place that they're living. And then like our passion is like for assets to be recognized and for goodness to be seen and not to hide from the bad stuff. So like in terms of the alleys, that like it's quite often taking these places that people think are horrible, like to be avoided, crime-ridden, whatever the impressions are, and to recast them as places that you could have a living room outside. So we link in a lot with public living rooms, and in itself that is like a creative approach to doing stuff. And a lot of the different things that we do, like we've got this phrase that we sort of hijacked from a group in Belfast called transformance art, and it's got its roots in like radical theology and people who are like breaking apart their religion, realizing that like if you're back, it could be a religion, it could be like any ideology or belief. If you unpick it, it's like a fabric, and you can weave that thread into new and interesting things. And that quite deeply informs a lot of what we do. So we've got this whole vein of transformance art where we'll do something weird with ritual or with like some sort of practical, like it's lots of things like meditation and chatting about beliefs, but quite often it's got this really arty vibe to the way that we do it, so that it takes it away from the head a little bit and puts it into the hands or the heart. And so we've got the alleys, that's urban rebirth, and then we've got paradoxes, like this set of rituals and unpicking beliefs and doing arty ways of sort of playing with what belief and deconstruction means, and then weaving that together in interesting ways. And all of this is like the hyper local level, and sometimes that gives us a chance to do funny things, like a gallery in the alley is just a really interesting way to recast that space, and the public living rooms are a really good way to it takes the agenda out of doing something good for each other. So it creates a space for mutuality where really you're just going into the alley or a cafe for a cuppa. We hold space for people to just meet with others simply, but quite often it ends up being like a really proactive mental health resource. Like how do you keep in touch with your feelings when, especially during a pandemic, when everything's up in the air? And so this year's been weird because we got really used to doing these kind of interesting creative spaces where we just have, especially in the alley, we'd have paint out so that if people wanted to then use their hands and then do something practical, they'd be able to do that. And it was quite often a good way of like vicariously being present with each other. But the pandemic's like just thrown interesting, like it's made that more or less impossible in the way that we used to do it. But our work straddles creativity, so it was quite easy to divert to Zoom and do some things on Zoom. And then like a strand of what we do that is essentially its own thing, Steel River Crafts, which was once called Come Together. And we started it years and years ago when we realized that loads of people just felt completely alienated from like being able to take on an interest in new craft. And it might be because of their own inhibitions, it might be because of like prohibitive costs or what people thought about the spaces where people learned those things. But we recognized that going back to the, like, we have lots of assets in our community already. Within our friendship group, everyone had an interest and skill that they knew. And so we started doing these workshops where each month we, like, one of us would bring a skill that we knew, and then the others would take part in that craft. So that was Come Together, where we'd come together, take it in turns to skill share. And that's carried on, and it's become Steel River Crafts. And that's really come to life over the last few months of the pandemic, where it's sort of blurred and morphed with all of these other things that we were doing. So we're doing mindful doodling at the moment, where we'll just drop into a Zoom call together. We'll have like quite simple instructions for like techniques that you could use, sharing ideas for how you could do like doodling, and it's quite stream of consciousness-y. So once you get past the need to get it right, it's just this beautiful space where people are like basically sat looking down while at a Zoom call for 30 minutes and really just focusing on the page in front of you. So we've got all these like really micro level things, and then we've got the wider stuff as well, where we love community conversations that generate the potential for more. So like there might be things that we initiate, and there might be big public art things that we're keen on doing, but a lot of what we do in the wider stuff is just to hold space for people to consider what they could do themselves. So like we're doing this reimagining borough thing where we're trying to create lots of different places where people could creatively interact, and it might be Pinterest, share a picture of what you think Middlesbrough could look like, go and pick a street in Portland, or like favela in Brazil, and people share like their ideas from outside, and it's really like a bit of a ruse to think what it could be like in Middlesbrough and to reframe how you consider that big ugly building in the town that you're sick of looking at, or the alley behind your house. So that's like kind of the wider level stuff that we do, where it's got a very community organizing vibe to it. So it's quite often prompting a conversation, finding creative ways of hosting those conversations and also recording them, so that as much as possible all voices are heard, and then as much as possible it's not then deferring responsibility to us as like activists to then do this stuff on people's behalf, but then making it really easy for people to say what they would like to do and to find the details that would help them to do it themselves. Like, how much would it cost to do that alligate? And so creativity is like, it's hugely influential in what we do on the way to community development. And then like that sort of, it also manifests in other ways. Like Borough Soup is an event that we've done for the last sort of 5 years. This is the 6th year that we're doing it, where it's a crowdsourced, crowdfunding event where people come along, several projects pitch an idea that they'd love to realise. It could be any sort of community idea, but community art, really grassroots organisations tend to do really well there, predominates towards that. And we love doing little creative stuff to make that space more than just money, more than just sharing ideas, and some sort of way of sucking it into the marrow and the fibre of your being, and finding ways for people to communicate in more than verbal methods. So like easiest way to do that is just to have like chalks out or like pens and a big piece of paper. So we do love to co-opt arty sort of ideas for pretty much everything that we do. I think I've covered like a ton of it, but what we do, it's motivated by this like core purpose that's got like lots of strings that define what it is, and then the product is that it fluxes and changes dramatically like on a monthly basis. So like it might look like a couple of dozen projects, but they're almost like manifestations of this core purpose. And then the core purpose is driven really hugely by these core drives of like to be creative and to let creativity infuse everything that we do, because it sort of reflects the complexity of human existence.
Brilliant. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, really interesting, because I normally kind of have a question about like what the arts does besides like that idea of an end product of a play or a book or whatever, but I think we've very firmly covered that, and I think that's the fundamental importance, I think, in the potential of the arts to really transform people's lives, to transform the places that they live, the way that they connect with each other and with you know their homes and their environments, and I just think that's incredibly powerful. I know that you felt actually a little bit removed from the wider arts community, really, because you're coming at it more as a kind of community organising framework. And yeah, obviously, to any artists out there that are watching this, do get in touch. These are extraordinary, you know, sometimes really small, but also really kind of ambitious projects. And I do know that the Arts Council have changed their approach to funding quite dramatically in the last year or two, with their new Let's Create manifesto that is far more geared towards community organising. So if there are artists out there that have got funding that want to have a real leap ahead in how to engage communities, then please do reach out to Andy. He's very approachable, and he really knows his stuff, and he knows that you know a lot of the local areas, or know somebody who does, which you know, on that course that we did last year on community organising, it's like so important to make sure that the people that you're engaging with are at the centre of it, and are the people that have the ideas, and really you're kind of there to empower them to bring their ideas to fruition.
Thanks for that, Lisa.
Yeah, so that was cool. I've only really done sort of 2 call outs in all of these interviews, but I think that's an important one. Is there anything else you'd like to say or share? Obviously I'll share all your like social media links and stuff in your interview.
Thanks. I don't know, like if there's anything else that you wanted to cover, then like, have you got any other questions that feel like they're quite key to the research? Well,
I mean, I think, you know, it's really, you know, this interview was really important to me because it kind of covers, I guess maybe I feel like it's the answer to that I would give to many of the questions that I've been asking people. I think in understanding, you know, if you're just an artist who just wants to like sit in your own home and crochet or do felt work or, you know, paint pictures or whatever, that's really, really brilliant and really, really important and really, really positive for you and your mental health. And it means you're not out doing, you know, out consuming unnecessary resources. And if you know, if you want to make a career in the arts, that's absolutely brilliant as well. But I guess I'm interested in the wider picture of can we transform, you know, potentially the entire world through the power of art? And I'm kind of, I guess, with this interview proposing that yes, we can. We might do it. We might start in tiny ways, but if everybody does that little tiny thing, if everybody just does their own alleyway, their own house and garden, whatever, their own being, and, you know, focuses on that, it's like, you know, if everyone does themselves and their environment, then it's done.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, because I hope this doesn't send it in too many directions, but we're just at this really interesting point as a society where like we're falling backwards a little bit because of the pandemic, but falling backwards takes you to an interesting place that you can then like work your way back through like the development that you sort of ran through like when you were younger, and like as a society it's like we ran through certain steps of development and it maybe became a bit pathological, and it's like trauma and pandemics and wars and whatever, they do something interesting to the way that people think. And I just feel like this is rich with potential, because if we're having to go back to let's steady ourselves and then work through our own development, like I think most of that's subconscious rather than conscious. But like as a society, if we ran through things like the join up between creativity and community, and if we ran through how does business and community and how does the art world and other worlds gel together, maybe there's just this amazing potential for like an unleashing of like rising consciousness that comes with those things clicking together. So I'm really curious about questions. Like answers are good, aren't they? But questions quite often take you to interesting places.
Yeah, absolutely. And most good answers turn into more questions. And I think it's been, you know, I think we're really privileged in this country, in most of Europe, to have imagined that the world was unchanging and stable and forever. You know, as the wars fall out of living memory, it's easy to think that everything always was predictable and always would be. And for a lot of people around the world, that's just never been the case. And for a lot of people, they're in permanent lockdown for one reason or another. And so. Yeah, so that was a privilege to begin with, and maybe because we've had that luxury of thinking that we live in a permanent and unchanging world, it has contained our own thoughts and made those kind of permanent and unchanging, whereas that you know, that's kind of dead thought. What we need is thinking. And I think there's been a lot more thinking going on, and that can only be a positive thing. And I hope we don't just go back to how things were, and that, you know, this has been a really useful pause for reflection. I mean, Buckminster Fuller in the 1950s calculated that in terms of real wealth, which is like global resources and human intellect, it would have been much better for the planet to pay most people $40,000 a year to stay at home, stop consuming all the, you know, going to the jobs and the cars, the petrol, the you know, it was to make plastic flowers, or plastic flowers to, you know, distribute plastic. It's like, what does that benefit, you know, anyone? And this whole you know, furlough scheme has been a bit of an exercise in that, and may pave the way to UBI, or at least the day off. I mean, this was something that we were campaigning for with the Rainbow Party, like 25 years ago, to, you know, if you could work 4 days a week, you would get as much done in that time if you could have a day off. You know, you wouldn't do any of the goofing about the, you know,
and what would you do with the extra day?
Yeah, exactly. You work a lot more more efficiently over the 4 days in order to earn yourself the 5th day off. So I think that's something you could look at as well. I mean, we could go on forever. You know, it's always an absolute pleasure to talk to you, Andy. And you do, you know, spark my brain off. So it's
Likewise.
But I suppose for the sake of me having to edit and transcribe and subtitle all this, we should probably call it a break there. But I'm sure we'll have many more conversations like this on and off Zoom.
Absolutely.
Andy.
Thanks, Lisa.
Take care. Toodly pip.